Hello, welcome to this presentation. My name is Melinda Suto and I'm a member of the collaborative research team to study the psychosocial issues in bipolar disorder, otherwise known as CREST.BD. This presentation is entitled Community-Based Research, Stigma Experiences in the Context of Living with Bipolar Disorder. It's my pleasure to present to the Society for the Study of Occupation, USA, 2011, Mountaintop Reflections. I'd like to acknowledge my two co-authors, team leader Dr. Aaron Mahalik and colleague Jamie Livingston. A spectrum of bipolar disorders is reflected in this chart. Briefly, mania refers to extreme sleep disturbances where one does not need much sleep, poor judgment, difficulties controlling one's temper, reckless behavior, and a very elevated mood, and sometimes also associated with grandiose thinking. In contrast, depression refers to a very depressed mood where a person either eats too much or too little, has difficulty concentrating, and a real lack of energy. So bipolar disorder 1 is typified by at least one manic episode and periods of major depression. In contrast, the green line here depicts bipolar disorder 2, which refers to a person never having a full manic episode, but the condition is typified by episodes of hypomania and periods of depression. Bipolar disorders affect men and women equally, and they first appear between the ages of 15 and 25 years. I'd like to just review how stigma of mental illness is conceptualized. It has three basic elements that are important to clarify. The first is stereotype. Stereotype refers to a negative belief. So in the context of mental illness stigma, this usually is something like a character weakness, incompetence, dangerousness, something that's very negative that really is not well supported with evidence. Prejudice tends to arise from this. This is the agreement with the belief and or an emotional reaction, a negative emotional reaction with that belief or that stereotype. Discrimination is actually the behavioral response to prejudice. So with this in mind, the popular conceptualization of mental illness has also three main sort of features or ways to look at it, ways to analyze it. The first is sort of in the macro area, and it's called structural stigma. And this refers to policies and practices of institutions, such as post-secondary institutions or professional organizations, that discriminate against people. This refers to structural stigma is usually initiated by those in positions of power who can, by their stereotype and their prejudice, enact policies that actually constrain the rights of people and the opportunities of people with mental illnesses. Social stigma, the social sort of level of stigma, is more at the societal level around large social groups, like groups in your community, people generally in society that aren't linked to a particular institution, but just your everyday people. So these are people who endorse stereotypes. In other words, they kind of agree with the stereotype and they act accordingly in a discriminatory way against a particular stigmatized group. And lastly, there's self-stigma. And this refers to people who, by virtue of growing up in our society and hearing other people's attitudes, perhaps even before they were themselves diagnosed with bipolar disorder, really internalize or take on those societal attitudes and discriminatory practices, and this can be quite limiting for them in their lives in terms of the choices that they make. Now I'd like to talk briefly about moving from traditional research style to the community-based participatory research that we now do. Community-based participatory research is an orientation in which scientific inquiry is conducted in partnership with community members, in this case people living with bipolar disorder and their family members, with the aims of engaging community members, building research capacity, and influencing social change. It's based on the idea that if you collaborate with people who have direct involvement and personal knowledge with a particular issue, you'll probably get findings of relevance to community members and be able to facilitate positive impacts on health and well-being. So the collaborative research team to study psychosocial issues in bipolar disorder came about in 2006 with a team planning grant that was given to us by the Michael Smith Foundation for Health Research. Since that time, we've had 3 community consultation days, one annual. Since 2009, we've had 3 community consultation days, and these community consultation days have been structured to give people an opportunity to network, to learn about the work of CREST.BD, and to also help us set our research agenda. Our current database at CREST.BD has over 350 people, some of whom would like to be and have been research participants in the past, and other people simply want to keep up with what we're doing at CREST.BD. We've also initiated a community consultation group of people living with bipolar disorder and academics to be able to provide advice on our various research projects. And at the bottom of the slide here is just the CREST.BD website, www.crestbd.ca/. So the specific research that I'm going to talk about today was embedded in a community consultation day, and our objective was to explore the understandings and experiences of stigma from the perspectives of people with bipolar disorder and their family members using community-based participatory research methods. So this is very exploratory research, and it was done from a qualitative perspective, and that means that we weren't measuring anything per se, but that we were trying to understand subjectively people's experiences, their perceptions, how they made sense of stigma in the context of bipolar disorder. So because we're committed to community-based participatory research, this was reflected in how we analyzed the data, how we interpreted that analysis, and the sorts of knowledge translation and knowledge exchange strategies that we're undergoing right now. In other words, how we disseminate the research. Our research design was such that we did our recruitment through our own CREST.BD database, through our newsletters, through the British Columbia Association for Mood Disorders newsletter, many community newspapers, Craigslist. We tend to recruit quite widely to make sure that many people have an opportunity to be involved in the research. We screened potential participants using various quantitative measures, including the Altman Self-Rating Mania Scale, the Quality of Life Bipolar Disorder Scale, the internalized Stigma of Mental Illness Scale. And the reason we did this is we wanted to be able to really be able to describe our participant sample very carefully and understand something about where they were at. All of the participants signed informed consent forms prior to participating in the focus groups. The community consultation day was the venue for this focus group research, and we chose to do the focus group research prior to the research presentations on stigma. And we did that because we wanted to make sure that people weren't influenced by something that they heard in terms of the research reports on stigma, and just had an opportunity to communicate their experiences and perceptions around stigma in bipolar disorder without that sort of influence. This community consultation day research project was held in a heritage mansion on the grounds of the University of British Columbia campus, and so was in a very pleasant environment that we hoped let people feel comfortable. I'd like to talk a little bit more about our research design, specifically our sample. We had a participant sample of 44 people, 28 individuals living with bipolar disorder 1 or bipolar disorder 2, and 16 family members and or supporters of people living with bipolar disorder. Some of these were family members of individuals that were also in the study that day. There were 30 women in our participant sample, 13 men and 1 transgendered individual. This was a middle-aged group with a median age of about 50 years old. It was a fairly well-educated participant sample. All had completed high school, and 25 individuals had at least a college or university education as well. The income levels varied in our participant sample of 44, with 24 participants earning less than $25,000 a year annually. The way we gathered data for this research project was through focus groups, and each focus group was asked the same 7 guiding questions. These questions were asked one at a time, and they were very open-ended questions, so there was no one right or wrong answer. We weren't looking for a particular answer, but they were very broad. Here are 5 of those questions. What does stigma mean to you? Can you tell us about your experiences of stigma? In what situations do you experience stigma most frequently? Least frequently? What are the effects of stigma on your life? And what ways of reducing stigma have worked for you personally? Continuing with the data collection and talking about analysis, we divided the group of 44 into 5 different groups. The reason we did this is we wanted to have some groups who had only people with bipolar disorder 1 or 2, and other groups that only had family members and supporters of people living with bipolar disorder. We thought that it would be more effective and more comfortable for people to talk if they could speak quite freely with others who may well share very similar experiences. Each of these groups were facilitated by CREST.BD team members, by 2 team members. The groups lasted an average of 90 minutes. They were all audio recorded and later transcribed word for word. The data analysis is important to mention here. Thematic analysis was what we did, and this is a form of pattern recognition and involves identification of themes, which is a way to report the data, through very careful reading and rereading of the transcripts. Through an iterative sort of back and forth process, the data were coded, organized, and then reorganized several times as categories were created and as relations between and within subcategories led to the development of preliminary themes. So we began by coding and grouping the data, and then we decided to choose a stigma concept framework. And after we'd done that, then we went back and recoded the data and interpreted the data using this particular framework. Now we've come to the findings, the results of our study. There were 3 themes that were developed from the participants' data. The first theme is restricted zones, explicit and implicit exclusionary practices linked to structural stigma. People with bipolar disorder and their families recounted discrimination experiences at work and school that resulted in views of these locations as sites of exclusion and missed opportunity. Participants attributed different types of exclusion to the misinformation and beliefs that others have about bipolar disorder and its implications for expected work and school capabilities. Restrictions on the options that individuals have in society, which arise from the power of institutions, are understood as structural stigma, according to the literature. So some of these restrictions included particular professions that required that people disclose any major psychiatric condition. One of these is the British Columbia Law Society. Secondly, a place of exclusion was the hospital. Families sometimes felt and were excluded, in other words, not invited, to discharge planning sessions that related to their loved one. They felt particularly frustrated by this because they felt, firstly, that they had a lot of information that could contribute to the healthcare provider's plans, and secondly, that they would be the main support person for this person upon discharge. Thirdly, another place where there were explicit exclusionary practices were the cases of when psychiatrists actually refused to treat people with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and a few people reported that this happened. While there were many positive interactions with healthcare staff, some interactions with some healthcare staff were completely negative and exclusionary. So there was a real perceived lack of compassion and understanding reported within the mental health care system that ranged from some general practitioners not even understanding very much about the bipolar disorder diagnosis and expected treatment and outcome, and also other mental health care practitioners who took a very authoritative, non-client-centered stance towards people living with bipolar disorder. There was also the issue of disclosure in employment and school settings, and I'd like to just recount one of the employment exclusionary practices that happened in employment, and it was particularly ironic because it happened to someone, or it was observed by someone who worked in a mental health organization along with peer support workers. So one participant described the expressions of stigma between consumer support workers and staff, and I quote, "They, peer support workers, were not allowed into the staff room, and I felt like that was just such a physical expression of stigma. They were accompanied to use the photocopier. It was just ridiculous. And they had totally gotten used to it and taken it for granted at this point. Like the back of the bus kind of thing. Ridiculous." End quote. Actually, the reality of consumers being a part of, but apart from, the mental health team was manifested in many different ways, such as not being given a key to the staff washroom. Structural stigma in competitive employment was often discussed in the context of fearing unwanted disclosure and job loss, reduced career advancement, and education concerns. Now I'd like to go on to the next theme. This second theme takes its name from one of our participants' comments. It's entitled, "Social Stigma. If my child had leukemia, you would all be bringing me lasagna." All participants discussed the inaccurate and misleading representation of individuals living with bipolar disorder in the media, where the focus has often been on sensational events rather than people's successful lives. Participants described how negative images reinforce bipolar disorder stereotypes through language and in films. People also discussed and described in the focus groups how they and their family members were sometimes excluded from social gatherings. So, for example, the parents would be invited to a social gathering and they would very explicitly be told not to bring their adult children who have bipolar disorder. Also, in terms of social stigma, there was a real sense of having some difficulty in maintaining friendships, and this would be an example of social stigma. And one person stated it this way, I lost friends when I became ill. People were withdrawing from me and kind of cutting me out of their life. And that was really confusing to me that it was happening, because I thought these were good friends. That's one of the ways in which stigma has moved against me." End quote. The impact of social stigma on quality of life also occurred in more subtle ways. When describing the meaning of stigma, one participant stated, quote, "I feel stigma shrinks my bubble, so I have a kind of less than experience to a certain extent." End quote. And now I'd like to go on to the third finding. The last theme I'd like to talk about is entitled, "What's Wrong with Me? The Burden of Self-Stigma." Participants described affective and cognitive elements of internalized stigma. They talked about shame, self-doubt, self-judgment, and even self-loathing as part of their daily experience of living with bipolar disorder. These kind of internalized negative attitudes influenced activities, they influenced relationships, and fairly major decisions that could affect the quality of their lives. The shame of having bipolar disorder was coupled with negative feelings, such as depression sometimes, in which one participant identified as a sort of vicious cycle. This person said, and I quote, "I don't really have that much stigma with other people, so it's mostly myself, judging myself and being uncomfortable with myself and thinking, am I weird or what's wrong with me?" End quote. As I alluded to just earlier, this sort of sense of self-stigma really limits what people choose to do in terms of furthering their education, in terms of choosing jobs, applying for promotions, and also socializing with other people. Self-stigma and the sort of sense of what's wrong with me can be a very powerful constraint on people moving forward in their lives. However, despite the self-stigma and the negative feelings that accompany it, there was also self-stigma coupled with hope. Because people also talked about taking responsibility for their thoughts and feelings, understanding the process of internalized stigma, but also the importance of getting very credible information, learning more about bipolar disorder. And what they found that helped them create hope was really seeing other people and reading about other people who could live well with bipolar disorder. These sorts of more positive things really fostered hope. And in the words of one person, and I quote, "Bipolar disorder is part of who I am, a big part, but it's not all. I have a million other things going on, and I just want to see where life takes me and be out there in the world as I am." End quote. Having presented the three themes, now I'd like to discuss these themes or findings briefly. What we've learned in this project is it really reaffirms what we already know. That is, many mental illnesses or mental health conditions share very similar stigma experiences, and bipolar disorder is similar in this regard. Our study also shows that an inductive coupled with a deductive approach to data analysis is very useful for understanding what people have said and then trying to sort of situate those findings in a way that may help promote change. Our study, modest in size and exploratory, has also really confirmed our commitment to use community-based participatory research as a principled and a progressive means of doing research that has a number of important features. It asks the right questions. It draws from people who are experts, in other words, people who have had a particular experience and are living a particular experience, and can be a catalyst for change for people who live with bipolar disorder and for their supporters. So we are firmly committed to continue to use community-based participatory research methods to create knowledge and to foster hope for people living with bipolar disorder and those who are supporting them. This concludes my presentation. I would just like to acknowledge the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Knowledge Translation, Meetings Planning and Dissemination Grant, and the same Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Neurosciences, Mental Health and Addictions, Meetings Planning and Dissemination for their financial support of our study. And now I've reached the end of the presentation. I would like to thank you for your patience in listening and your interest in this topic. In a few following slides, I've posed some questions for our discussion, and I hope that we have a lively discussion that I can learn from your ideas and your questions. And again, thank you for coming to my presentation.